Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. Today we're going to be looking at For Your Eyes Only, which is a compilation of 5 short stories. It's something a little bit different from the Bond books we've reviewed so far, so I'm looking forward to this. Most of these stories are based on unproduced outlines for an American TV show that Fleming was commissioned to write about James Bond 007, and obviously that series never got made, so he repurposed those outlines and created the short stories in this compilation, and I think we can all agree that it's for the betterment of just the world that series never happened, because if that TV show had happened, maybe we would not have had the cinematic adventures of 007. Not that Ian Fleming will have seen it that way at the time, I'm sure, as, you know, it was apparently a very frustrating time for him. He was getting a little bored writing for the character, and the new project excited and interested him a lot, but you know what, for all of that frustration, at least we have a really interesting bag of stories here in this compilation. Now, I'm going to be going through these stories in the order in which they are in the book, and I know that this isn't necessarily the order in which they were published, but this is the order that I experienced them in, and so with that in mind, let's have a look at the very first story in this compilation, From a View to a Kill. I found this to be a very much straight-down-the-line spy story. Bond is hanging out in Paris after a failed mission and musing about France and how it ain't what it used to be before, you know, since 1945, and he starts to fantasize about spending the evening with this very attractive lady who is, you know, got out of a car in front of him at the cafe, and then, who would have guessed that girl actually comes up to him and enlists him into a mission. The woman is Mary Ann Russell, who is a local agent for SHAPE and takes Bond to meet her head of security. Bond is enlisted to investigate the shooting of a NATO dispatch rider who was carrying reports from NATO headquarters to an MI6 station in France on a motorcycle. And everyone is stumped as to how this guy was murdered, but Bond has a hunch because, you see, the motorcycle rider was murdered on this particular stretch of road, and Bond notices that there was a travelling gypsy camp based near that spot for a while a few months ago, and that's a hunch enough for Bond to go to that particular spot and investigate. So Bond heads out to that spot and dons full, camouflage gear and, stakes out. Bond stakes out for a while, and he's just kind of, admiring the scenery. It's a beautiful morning and all that, and then he sees the assassin and 2 assistants leaving a hidden underground base in this field, in this clearing. And so then Bond puts a plan to action to kill the assassin and get inside the bunker and, investigate, get all the secrets and all that kind of stuff. I really love how Bond first discovers the existence of a bunker. He's just like, looking around, and then they have this periscope that kind of shoots up from the bunker, and it's like, Bond just sees this, and at first it's really confusing exactly what is happening, because they're describing this like, this turning flower in the middle of this, clearing. But it all becomes clear very quickly, and I think it's quite an ingenious plan. So Bond puts his plan into action and dresses up as a dispatch rider and goes out on the motorcycle, and when the assassin comes out on his motorcycle to try and kill Bond, Bond kills that guy, and then dons that guy's gear so that he can get close to the bunker without the other 2 people in the bunker knowing, and so they don't destroy anything in there preemptively if they realise that Bond is actually someone else. Then Bond gets into a gunfight with the 2 assistants in this clearing, and one gives Bond a real fight, and it looks like Bond might actually get killed when that particular goon is shot dead, and who should have done it but Mary Ann Russell, who is behind the guy with a bunch of other agents who have come to sort out this bunker and take all the secrets out of it, while Bond and Mary Russell head off into the sunset and presumably to spend a nice evening in France. So when I say straight down the line spy story, I mean that in the sense that I found it very economically plotted and structured. There's a nice hook at the start of the story where, before we meet Bond, we actually get to see the NATO rider getting assassinated, and things move along quite nicely until the exciting climax at the end. It's really easy to see how this thing started life as an outline for an episode of a TV show. The thing reads very much like Fleming just lifted scene directions and dialogue straight from an outline, and it definitely feels like a lesser mission when compared to the stuff in the main novel, so there are never really any huge stakes, but as a little spy story, I thought it read perfectly well. Something I'm very curious about is exactly what a Fleming scripted Bond TV show would look like. When so much of these books are just like Bond's internal monologue and, we hear his thoughts and opinions and all that kind of stuff, indeed, when we first meet Bond in this story, he's sat at a cafe and we have a few pages of him just, talking through his opinions about France. And I don't know if the idea was that, maybe in the TV show we would have had like some kind of voiceover where, we would be hearing Bond's inner thoughts, or whether all of that stuff was just kind of added in as the story transitioned from a TV outline to a short story in a book. But I will say that the best bits of this particular story for me are the bits where Bond is alone. I love it when he's at that cafe at the very start of the story, and I love it when he's on the stakeout later on in the clearing. And these scenes take up a good chunk of the story, but they're without any dialogue, so I don't know how that would translate to the screen if this were a TV show. Personally, I didn't find there to be a whole lot of very interesting character stuff about Bond in this particular short, but I do really like Bond being paired up with the shapehead of security, who's this very bland, very dull, grey-haired guy without much in the way of personality, and Bond just can't stand the guy. But there is, there's more of the, Bond being a lovelorn guy pining for the company of a young, attractive woman, and it's very tragic, really, when he's having these musings at the cafe at the start of the story, and, he's already done that in a few of the main novels, so I didn't think that was an especially new or interesting development, but just how kind of, sad, I suppose, his imaginings get here is what's kind of interesting. He's just fantasizing about taking some young Parisian woman on a date and giving her a load of money and, saying, I will call you by a different name. And interestingly, one of those names that he, muses about calling her is Solange. So that's, perhaps they took that name from here for the Casino Royale Bond girl, I don't know. But it's just really weird that Bond would have a fantasy like that. I mean, I don't know, maybe in the 50s, it was considered normal, warm-blooded heterosexual practice to rent a woman and take her out and change her name and then eventually bed her at the end of the night. But now, for me reading that, it's just a bit weird. It just paints a super tragic figure, or at least that's the impression that I get, reading it now. But maybe at the time, maybe the impression was different and you just thought this was like, oh, he's just a regular bloke? I don't know. The boring shape guy is probably the only other character with a bit of detail. I mean, there's Mary Ann, obviously, but she's a woman written by Fleming, so obviously there's not going to be much going on there, and she's quite plucky and reminded me a bit of a more confident Gala Brand, and indeed, elements of this short story were born out of Fleming's, ideas for the backstory of Hugo Drax in Moonraker, so maybe the similarity isn't entirely just in my mind. As you might have guessed, there's absolutely nothing here that resembles anything from A View to a Kill, the movie. Nothing, nada, zip. Which is surprising, actually. I mean, the setup could have been a section of a Bond movie, at least. I'm surprised that it hasn't been adapted into any Bond screen adventure just yet. It's a mini-mission, so while it's certainly not gonna be, held up as a defining James Bond adventure or anything, I thought it was great, and I appreciated its simplicity. It kind of, eased me into the notion of James Bond short stories, and so it was a perfect introduction to this collection. So next up is the collection's namesake, For Your Eyes Only, where we start to see some similarities, at least, to the cinematic counterpart. So the story begins with a perfectly quaint British couple known as the Havelocks going about their business in their beautiful Jamaican estate when some ne'er-do-wells come and try to buy their home from them, at first quite politely and then getting more and more abrasive. After the Havelocks refuse to sell their property, they are promptly murdered in a few very tense passages, actually, and that whole part of the story is really great. Anyway, turns out that the Havelocks are personal friends of M, or at least M was the best man at their wedding years and years ago, and doesn't sound like he's seen them all much since then, and he's never met their now grown-up daughter, but best friends. I mean, regardless of how that might seem a bit odd, he's actually, quite torn up by the murder of this couple that he knew, and so he sends Bond off on a sort of, well, off-the-record mission to get revenge and murder the people who killed his friends. And Bond, of course, agrees to this, and M is quite, humble, I guess, in making this request. It turns out that the guy who murdered the Havelocks is Hector Gonzalez, and he received his orders from his boss, Herr von Hammerstein, and aren't those just a pair of real great villain names? It's a nice setup, even if they don't do all that much with it. Like, I like that Bond is sent off on a personal mission that isn't actually personal to him. He is being used as a blunt instrument for M to get the revenge that he desires, and that's really cool. But, I mean, Bond has to be a little bit kind of extra sly, because he has to sneak into the United States from Canada in order to access von Hammerstein's base at Echo Lake. But aside from that, it kind of just feels like, oh, well, this could have just been a regular on-the-record mission. Anyway, Bond gets to Echo Lake and sort of stakes out for a bit and bides his time waiting for the right moment to strike when he bumps into a young lady who is Judy, the Havelock's daughter, who is also out for revenge with her bow and arrow. I like that Bond has to kind of mull over exactly what to do with Judy when he first comes across her. He's just like certain that she's gonna screw things up, but she kind of does get what she wants. As von Hammerstein is diving into a pool, she shoots an arrow that hits him square in the back, and then it's up to Bond to take out the rest of the goons, including Gonzalez. Judy is injured in the battle, so it's up to Bond to apply some first aid, which includes snogging her for some reason. And then he's like, oh yeah, there's a guy in London who'd really like to meet you, and I guess he means M, but I just love the idea that he's gonna turn up on, like, Monday at the office with this young woman and be like, hey, here you go, and M's like, what do I do with her now? Like, what, I just love the idea that Bond's gonna saddle M with this, like, adopted daughter. Given that there's a more personal aspect to this particular mission, it feels less, like, straight down the line than From a View to a Kill did to me. Bond is out to fulfill a personal request from M, which is nice, and my favourite part of this particular story on the page is the section where M is making this request of Bond, and he's obviously a bit uncomfortable about doing it, and he's clearly shook up by his friend's murder, and that all reads really, really well. As I mentioned earlier, the villains, Hector Gonzalez and Herr von Hammerstein, have some great names, but they don't make much of an impression, and largely because Bond is just observing them from a very far away distance for much of the story. I mean, we get a little bit from Gonzalez and the dialogue that he has with the Havelocks at the start of the story, but there's not much, in the way of the character there, and maybe that's okay. This is a short story, not every villain needs to be as big and bold as the ones we find in the full novels. They're just kind of portrayed as very sleazy guys, and like at their base they have a couple of women there who I guess are just sort of like paid and or held captive, I don't quite know, but there's enough, unsavory detail about them to make them just the right level of detestable. Or at least I think it's supposed to be unsavory. I mean, in From a View to a Kill, when Bond was talking about hiring a woman, I'm not sure if we were supposed to think of that as being unsavory, but, Judy Havelock is yet another quite bland Fleming female. At first, she's very spunky and she's all tough and out for revenge and all that, but then once the whole mission is over, she just becomes a figure for Bond to sleep with. And that all happens, like, really abruptly, like, in a matter of, a few paragraphs, she goes from badass killer to simpering, vulnerable sex object. So there isn't much, really, that's translated from this story into For Your Eyes Only, the movie, despite the movie taking the title of this particular story. There's actually another story in this collection that has a much more faithful transition from page to screen, but for the For Your Eyes Only short story, there's really only just the notion that this, British couple are murdered and their daughter seeks revenge and ends up killing one of the people involved in that assassination by shooting him in the back as he's diving off a diving board into a pool and, straight between the shoulder blades. I do find that interesting, like, that very broad detail of, daughter out for revenge, and then the very specific detail of how that daughter gets her revenge. If I'm honest, I didn't really enjoy this story as much as I enjoyed From a View to a Kill, but they are very much cut from the same cloth. You can just imagine how both of these stories would play out in a, an hour block of television with commercials. For Your Eyes Only has its moments, for sure. I just didn't find the revenge plot as engaging as the more mystery-focused plot, if you will, of From a View to a Kill. So that's the first 2 stories in this compilation. There are 3 more to go, and that'll be the focus of another video. A couple of real oddballs coming up, but one of those oddballs happens to be my very favourite story in this compilation, so do tune in for that review video, and until next time, Bond fans, as always, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as, if you haven't already followed me on Twitter and Facebook, please do that, and if you want to check out my new Patreon page, you can head over there and check that out as well, but until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.